Hey guys, this is Whiteflame, and I'm here with Raisor, and we're about to do uh, the first debate in our first debate in the official live debate tournament hosted by Tough. Should be very interesting. Neither of us have done much live debate recently, but I respect Razor quite a bit, and I love the opportunity to get to debate with him. Our topic is about Bowe Bergdahl, and specifically uh, whether he should be convicted and punished as a result of leaving the army base. I'm sure we'll get into that in more detail as we go, but the two charges against him are desertion and misbehavior before the enemy, and we'll be discussing what the basis is for whether or not he should be punished as a result of what he actually did. And Razor will be pro, I will be con. We decided these by coin flip about 5 minutes ago. So whenever you're ready, Razor, let's get started.
Okay, okay, I'm gonna start the clock right now.
Sure.
So I'm taking pro, and I'm defending the resolution that Bergdahl ought to be convicted of desertion or misbehavior before the enemy. So the facts of the case are pretty well established. On June 30th, 2009, Private First Class Bowe Bergdahl abandoned his post and set out into the desert of Afghanistan. His intention in doing so, by his own account, was to incur a court-martial and bring attention to perceived perceived laziness or laxness in his military outfit. I think to pretty much anyone, that alone is enough to answer the question of whether or not Bowe deserted his post. He left without notifying his superiors, without leaving any explanation beyond a note, which I'll get into later, as to why he left. In leaving his post, he endangered the lives of his fellow troops and shirked his duty as a military officer. So, to get some insight into why Bowe made the decision to abandon his post, we can look to the last correspondence he sent to his parents while he was posted in Afghanistan. So what I'm about to read is an excerpt from this letter, and I think it captures pretty well what Bowe's mindset was in the days leading up to his desertion. So these are Bowe's own words that I'm about to read. "The future is too good to waste on lies, and life is way too short to care for the damnation of others, as well as to spend it helping fools with their ideas that are wrong. I have seen their ideas, and I am ashamed to even be American. The system is wrong. I am ashamed to be an American. And the title of U.S. soldier is just the lie of the fools. The U.S. Army is the biggest joke the world has to laugh at. It is the army of liars, backstabbers, fools, and bullies. The horror that is America is disgusting. There are a few more boxes coming to you guys. Feel free to open them and use them." That excerpt makes it pretty clear what Bowe's estimation of the U.S. Army was when he walked off that base. So, in regards to the two charges that Bowe faces, desertion and misbehavior before the enemy, we can look at the issue of desertion. Desertion is defined as abandoning one's post with the intention of escaping combat. And it's pretty clear from this letter that that's exactly what Bowe intended to do. In his view, the future before him was too good to waste on engaging in what he viewed to be a frivolous mission. And his solution to this was to leave, was to give up his duty, to forfeit the obligation that he owed both the Army, the United States of America, and his fellow troops, and to quit. Now, in this letter, Bergdahl mentions a few more boxes coming to you guys. What that was personal items, including his laptop, that he shipped back from his post to his parents before leaving. This might sound like an insignificant detail, but in fact it's not. A key feature of desertion is whether or not Bowe intended to permanently leave or whether or not he had just gone AWOL and had left his post without leave and was planning on returning. The boxes he sent home are clear indications that Bowe was not intending on returning to his post and fulfilling his duties. He gave away his personal belongings, including his laptop. He had no intention of coming back to his post and using them again. Another piece of evidence in determining Bowe's state of mind is a letter which has since gone missing and unfortunately can't be fully substantiated. But an officer in Bowe's platoon reported finding a letter that said that Bowe had left to start a new life and that he would not be returning. Even his own story, in which Bowe claims he was leaving to draw attention to misdemeanors or a poorly operated military outfit, belies his intent not to return. Bowe's intent, by his own account, which I'm skeptical of, is that he wanted to incur a court-martial and call attention to the failures of his outfit. Under this account, Bowe viewed himself as walking off into the desert, being captured, and not returning to duty. No matter how you cut it, Bowe abandoned his post without the intent to return and therefore deserted. Now, there's another count that he faces, and that's misbehavior before the enemy. And the criteria for this is asking the question whether or not he endangered the troops of his platoon in leaving. Following Bowe's abandonment of his post, the entire operation in Afghanistan went on red alert for a full month. For a full month, there were increased patrols specifically to look for Bergdahl. This means for a month, men in the U.S. Army were putting themselves in danger. They were making patrols they would not have been making if Bergdahl hadn't left, and in doing so, endangering their own lives. Additionally, in the 5 years of Bergdahl's captivity, there were standing orders to report any information regarding Bergdahl's whereabouts and pursue any leads that might result in the recapture of Bergdahl into U.S. possession. These standing orders had a myriad of second-order effects that adversely impacted the ability of the U.S. Army to safely perform their duty in Afghanistan. It's impossible to know just how many men and women died as a result of Bergdahl's actions, but it is a safe assumption to make that the additional stress that Bergdahl placed on the U.S. Army in the war zone of Afghanistan resulted in men and women dying, losing their lives in the service of the U.S. military. I'm going to read one final quote that came about during the investigation. An officer from Afghanistan was asked the question, did taking out that unplanned 9-man foot patrol decrease your ability to defend observation post Mest, in reference to searching for Bergdahl? The officer replied with clarity, it absolutely did. So not only can we answer affirmatively that Bergdahl is guilty of desertion, but also that he is guilty of misbehavior before the enemy by endangering the safety of his fellow troops. I'm now open for cross-examination.
I believe we're doing cross-examination after my speech.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought it was after each speech.
We could do it after this one if you'd rather.
So are you thinking? All right, we'll just time out. So are you thinking just like a 2-minute back and forth, basically, more like a crossfire than a cross-examination?
We could do a cross-examination instead if you'd rather. That's fine.
Yeah, let's do a 1.5 minute cross-examination, just following each of the constructives.
Okay, I'm setting my watch.
Okay.
Okay. So when Bowe Bergdahl actually said that he was going to be taken into captive essentially by the U.S. military as soon as he arrived at this other base, was he actually saying I don't want to be a part of the military anymore?
I mean, that's a question that I think we won't be able to answer. I mean, Bergdahl might have his accounts of what he viewed things were, but I think actions speak louder than words. And the fact of the matter is he walked off the base, shipped his belongings home, and appeared to have no intention of returning to his duty.
So what was his alternative then? What was he trying to do?
Again, I can't postulate as to what Bergdahl thought he was trying to do in that moment. I mean, we're speculating on what his motivations were 5 years ago. I want to stick to the facts of the case, which are simply that he abandoned his post and he had no indication that he intended to return or that he even valued the service that he was performing. His letter speaks pretty clearly on that issue.
Intent is a very important part of that motivation. So if you can't establish the strong motivation, how can you establish intent?
I think that his actions do establish intent. I mean, in this situation, you need pretty strong evidence that his intent was other than to abandon his post. If yeah.
Okay, that's time.
Okay.
So. Okay, my time's gonna start now. So let me be clear to start that I'm not going to defend him on the basis that he has some kind of psychopathology. Whatever was going through Bergdahl's head, we don't have any basis for determining that it was the result of some kind of mental illness or some other issue. Many people have brought that up in the news. It's not something that I want to deal with because it's not a basis for understanding whether he's guilty of these things, and it might be a basis for whether he should be punished, but I'm not going to bring that up. But we really have to look at the man. Here's Bergdahl. He's a private in the U.S. military. He's someone who's not experienced much in terms of any real-time activity in the field. He did have a couple of missions, but none of them were particularly huge for him, and he certainly wasn't able to wield a gun in any of them. And but he understands the difference between what he perceives as a reasonable danger and an unreasonable danger. And he's able to convey that difference quite clearly. If you listen to the interview he actually had, it becomes quite clear that the issue is a breakdown in the lines of communication. It's a breakdown in the lines of communication with the rest of the military structure, specifically with his direct superiors and the people that he was working with. He feels that they are not adequately protecting the members of his unit. And even further, he feels that they're actively seeking to endanger the members of his unit. That's something that's very important because that perspective doesn't just come from his thought process being weird or different from anyone else's. It comes from a series of experiences he had with his superiors, including many in which people threatened what basically amounted to physical violence against him, and these were people who would be giving him orders in the field in the near future. And he needs to know that those people are going to actually do the right thing by him. That's why he stepped out. That's the basic reason why he decided to do what he did. And so what we're asking ourselves is whether Bergdahl should be convicted or punished. We need to understand the context of his decision in totality. So first of all, I'm gonna go against my opponent's assertion that he deserted with the intent to leave permanently, especially since these concerns were brought up constantly to people in his own unit. So he made quite clear that there were a number of problems that he was concerned with the leadership of his unit, and that he was specifically hoping to find ways to address that. He told his part of the story is that Bergdahl is that he wanted to walk 24 hours away, approximately 24 hours away, to another area, get essentially taken down and get essentially taken from there, jailed for a short period of time, and get his opportunity to speak up about the disaster, what he perceived as a disaster with the leadership of his unit. This is what he was dealing with. This is what he's trying to address. That doesn't seem like permanent desertion to me, and it seems like that would be something that my opponent has to establish much more strongly. The second is that he's got a point, and it should be taken seriously. Communication issues like this need to be addressed. There needs to be a substantive response to the problem of people not feeling safe under their superiors, people feeling that they are going to be sent out into the field almost to die without any real response. When they got back from a terrifying mission that involved tremendous amounts of IED explosions and guns being fired at them with plenty of opportunity for people to die, the response was, why haven't you guys shaved since you've been gone? This is an incredibly callous response, and it shows that there's a disregard for their basic lives, and that's something that he was reasonably concerned about. Having that concern is something that should be expressed, but he didn't have any means to express it. He didn't know how to express it, and that's mainly the result of a military system that didn't provide him any means to report this behavior from his superiors. He didn't have any opportunity to do so because he didn't perceive any opportunity to do so. The communication lines were cut in that regard as well, and there was just not enough opportunity to discuss this, but for him to express his concerns with them. And so what this represents is a basic breakdown in the lines of communication with his military personnel. And that's a big problem in a military that requires that communication to be pitch perfect throughout. Without that good communication, there's no way that we could ever hope to have a successful mission in Afghanistan or elsewhere, particularly when it comes to trying to establish a good relationship with the Afghani people, which is not being established very well by our current system because of those lines of communication failing. So it's a major reason why the mission in Afghanistan is failing as a whole, and a major reason why we're still there and still putting our people at risk. Bergdahl is expressing his discontent with that system. I think that needs to be brought up. But the third problem is that this is a man who was imprisoned, beaten, and threatened with death for 5 years straight. He was shown countless videos of beheadings, and with the intent to terrify him. And the idea that we can submit him to a prison sentence of any length is ridiculous. This is a man who clearly suffers from a certain amount of PTSD. Now, I said I wouldn't talk about his mental state as a means to prevent him from getting this trial as a whole, but we have to recognize that this specific punishment is a terrible one to express. It's one that actually will feed into the problems that he's dealt with as a result of his captivity. His long-term captivity should not be extended by the U.S. military through any kind of jailing. And I think that pushing him through that is just going to make things worse. It's going to put him in further harm, and it's going to exacerbate any sort of mental damage he's taken as a result of his time in captivity.
Okay. Okay. Are you open for cross-examination?
Yes.
Are there protocols within the military which allow for, say, privates to report perceived misbehavior of their superiors outside of their platoon? Do those protocols exist?
They do.
Was it possible for Bergdahl to come in contact with the press while he was serving and observing these perceived misbehaviors by his superiors?
On his missions that he actually engaged in, I don't think so. I don't think he was ever in contact with the press. He did have an instance. Wait. He did have an instance where they were taking photos of him, but he was actually degraded in the media as a result, and degraded by his superiors as well.
Did he have access to a computer and internet while he was serving?
I'm not sure.
Okay. Is it your position that individual soldiers ought to be able to leave their post whenever they feel that their commanders are not performing as they should?
I didn't say that, but there is a specific response. So the system has to be set up in a way that individual soldiers feel they have the means to respond to a problem. If they don't know what those means are, then some soldiers are going to feel that they have to take it into their own hands. I'm not saying that the method he used was the correct one. I'm saying that he felt he had no other choice, and that's because the lines of communication were against him.
Okay. Okay. All right. So I'm going to begin my second speech. I'm going to start the clock now. I'm going to begin by just going down my opponent's arguments and rebutting them. So my opponent's first major argument is that there's a breakdown in the lines of communication, and that somehow Bergdahl's desertion of his post was, I don't know, an attempt to solve that. I mean, this is just a ridiculous argument. The idea that somehow poor performance of military leadership is best addressed by soldiers walking out on their own into the middle of a war zone and endangering their fellow soldiers is absurd. And the fact of the matter is, there exist military protocols that allow low-level troops to report misconduct of their superiors. In fact, there are specific protocols that tell these soldiers that they should go to other officers outside of their direct chain of command so that they don't have to worry about reprisals from their superiors. On top of this, we live in a society where the press serves an important role in making sure that there isn't misconduct in contained organizations like the military. Bergdahl was in contact with reporters in the field. He could have pulled them aside and talked to them. He had access to a computer. He was sending letters home to his family. He could have told them to contact the press. There are any number of ways that Bowe could have brought this issue up to the press and had this issue resolved in a reasonable way that didn't endanger the lives of his fellow troops. Furthermore, we aren't here to talk about whether or not the military was or wasn't performing correctly, whether or not the officers were endangering the lives of Bergdahl and his platoon leaders. We don't know the full facts. We aren't in a position to judge that. And more importantly, Bergdahl is in a position to judge that. The military doesn't work on the premise that any individual can decide that the organization as a whole isn't performing up to their standards and then just deal with that as they see fit. Discipline is important to the military because in the military, the lives of every individual is depending on the man next to them. And if the military doesn't function as a unit, if individuals are allowed to go rogue, walk off into the desert, then people die. And that's exactly what has happened in this case. And it's pretty clear from Bergdahl's letter when he says that he's ashamed to be an American and that the U.S. Army is the biggest joke the world has to laugh at, that what happened in this case is Bergdahl made his own assessment of the military and decided to take matters into his own hands. The military simply can't function if we allow individuals like that to act on their own whims and get off without any sort of punishment, without any sort of justice. Second, my opponent claims that Bergdahl's plan belies the fact that he wasn't planning on permanently abandoning the military, that he planned on coming back in some way. But the fact is, this isn't true. Bergdahl wasn't planning on coming back. He was planning on, through some ambiguous means, drawing attention to, or at least this is his claim, that he was going to draw attention to abuses within the military and somehow rectify them. But nowhere in that plan does it say that he plans on returning back to his post. No, he was by his own account, Bergdahl was planning on using the military protocol of dealing with people who abandon their post to get out of his duty. The end goal for Bergdahl, no matter how you cut it, was that he was not going to be at his post the day after he walked off of it. He left his post for good, and that is enough to convict him of desertion. But more importantly, this issue of whether or not he planned on returning or not doesn't address the second charge that he's charged with, which is misbehavior before the enemy by endangering his fellow troops. And this is something that my opponent hasn't addressed. The fact of the matter is, in the month following Bergdahl's desertion, there were overtime shifts where people were out on patrols looking for Bergdahl, putting themselves in the line of fire, going into villages, knocking on doors of people who may emerge from that door with a gun, and that's all because of Bergdahl's, I don't know, his fantasy that somehow he was going to save the military from perceived abuses. Finally, My opponent claims that the fact that Bergdahl was imprisoned for 5 years and subjected to terrible conditions, and that's not a point I'm going to dispute. The conditions that Bergdahl suffered were terrible, that somehow that absolves him of any guilt from his actions. Well, I have a few things to say about this. One is that he would never have been in that condition if he had simply done his duty, stayed by his post, and followed the chain of command in addressing the grievances he had. So as awful as the conditions were that Bergdahl suffered, the fact of the matter is he brought them on himself. And nobody should ever be subjected to torture, but there is an element of responsibility where you have to say, these horrible conditions, they weren't done by the military, and ultimately the military isn't responsible for the conditions that he suffered. I would also say that justice requires giving people what they are owed. And in deserting his post, Bergdahl harmed his fellow troops by putting them in danger, and those troops are owed something. They are owed that justice be done. And the only way for justice to be done is for Bergdahl to go through due process and be convicted of the failure of the charges that are levied against him. The fact that he was in prison for 5 years does nothing in upholding the rule of law. It does nothing in upholding the obligation that the Army has to serve justice to the men that Bergdahl wronged. Finally, in abandoning his post, Bergdahl threatens a breakdown of discipline in the Army, which I have described before. So it's imperative that the Army show that no matter what the case, if you desert, if you do not follow the chain of command, you will face the consequences of that. Whatever happened out in the field due to Bergdahl's capture doesn't change the fact that the military needs to uphold discipline, it needs to uphold order, otherwise it risks the lives of the people who serve. And the only way for that justice, the only way for that order to be upheld is for Bergdahl to go through a formal court-martial and be convicted of the charges levied against him. That's my time.
All right, so I'll start with my time. Just a second.
Are we doing cross-X?
Do I do another cross-X? We could do that.
Yeah, I think so. We'll just do it after each constructive.
Okay. Okay. So, how many previous desertions have happened in the U.S. military?
That's a fact that I don't have in front of me.
And how many of those? Do you have any idea how many previous deserters have been tried?
I imagine not many.
So why do you think that this specific one is really important towards future system cohesiveness?
Well, it's really high profile. I mean, it's a national news story, and I think that Bergdahl put his fellow troops in danger in a way that most desertions didn't. I mean, again, there was a month where the entire U.S. armed forces in Afghanistan was dedicated to finding this one individual.
I get that, but why do you think that this is suddenly going to lead to a number of other desertions or people taking actions out of hand or something like that? Why is this specific one going to modify the behavior of other people in the military?
Look, I'm not arguing for a causal link that somehow this specific incidence will, cause the collapse of the U.S. military, but what I am arguing is that military discipline is built on principles and built on procedures, and when we allow those to be chipped at, we do jeopardize the efficacy and the safety of the people who are serving. And I did make another argument that just out of a sense of justice, the men and women that Bergdahl endangered are owed the conviction of Bergdahl on those 2 counts.
All right. Okay, I'll start my speech. So I'm also going to focus on rebuttal in this speech, thanks to my opponent for a number of really good arguments. He starts off by saying that Bergdahl's desertion is not a solution to the problem of misconduct of his superiors. In many ways I agree with this. I don't think that it is the solution. I don't think it's even a good solution. The problem is, and this is fundamentally something that Razor's missing, is while those systems exist, while there are systems of response that exist within the military structure, first of all, they require an incredible amount of time and effort to access, and second of all, they don't know about them. They're not informed of them by their superiors. They have to go digging to find these things. They're rather difficult to get at. He does bring up this other aspect, having access to a computer, access to the press. First of all, his access to the press wasn't exactly good. They took photos of him with outside of his military uniform while he was working on, I don't remember, but he was digging something. In any case, his access to the press had no good connotations. He wouldn't have wanted to approach the press, and if he had approached the press, he likely would have gotten the same response he got from those photos, which was to get chewed out and be physically threatened as a result. As for the idea of access to a computer, posting things online is not going to have a big amount of feedback against the military. Even if he can prove it, they're not going to do much about it. That's not a big response. That's not something that's going to engender any of the response he wants. He needed to have an actual audience with his generals. This is one way he perceived as having that means to do so. Did he choose the right route? That's not what's up for question here. The question is whether or not he felt like he had any other route available to him, and in this case he felt like he had no other options, so he chose this one. So he says that we're not in a position to judge communication issues. I think we are in a position to judge communication issues, especially when he's telling these stories that are corroborated by his own unit and by other people in the military. There is clearly a breakdown in the structure that's available there. When people are actively threatening you physically, you do not want those same people to send you out into the field. You are noticeably concerned about whether they have your well-being in mind. That is something that should be addressed, and that's something that is a very obvious objective problem. This isn't something that, oh, well, he just perceived it. No, it's something very clear that is happening there. So he talks about how discipline is important to the military and lives depending on the unit. The problem is that the communication structure is disrupting that fundamental unit. That's the problem. He's not able to listen to his superiors because he's unsure of what they're actually going to do. Having a better line of communication would have helped that. And specifically, letting him off this case allows him to actually have that conversation because now, as my opponent said, this is a high-profile case. It is an opportunity for him to talk about it. It's only because he still has these two major charges against him that he is not talking to them. That he's not talking to the media in general. That he's not making that huge effort to make this a big issue and actually talk to the military in a large way. It's only because of that barrier that we're not having this reasonable discussion about what should be happening when it comes to communication issues in the military. So he also talks about how Bergdahl wasn't planning on coming back, that he wanted to get out of his duty. I don't think that's at all clear. He had a perception that he would be taken off duty if he arrived at this other base. That wasn't that he didn't want to be on duty anymore, but even if that is the case, even if he didn't want to be in military duty, he was still trying to do a duty for the military. He was still trying to do something for his unit, still representing his unit as an actor to try and ensure their safety and their continued ability to succeed as members of the military. So then he talks about misbehavior before the enemy. He says that they went out looking for him, and so this resulted in threats on their lives. I don't think this is his personal misbehavior before the enemy. I think this shows a breakdown in how they responded to the problem. They rushed into sites. They made a huge scene. Yes, that is, that might have been a response to the situation, but that's on the military. That was their choice to push this action as far as possible and to rush into a number of different bases where they were putting themselves at physical risk. I admit that there's always going to be some amount of response problem, but and there's always yeah, and there's certainly some physical danger that was put in as a result of searching for Bergdahl, but that's a result of how the military decided to go about it, not as a result of the Bergdahl's leaving in general. That was their response. That wasn't his choice. As he does say that Bergdahl would never. This is the most ridiculous response, though. He says that Bergdahl would never have gotten in the condition he was, the 5 years of captivity, if he hadn't wandered off base. Well, I'm kind of flabbergasted by this. This is a young, naive private who clearly took an action that he didn't understand the full gravity of, and my opponent's response to that is, let's punish him more. Let's make sure that that naivete is forced on him even further, and that we push his mental state to the breaking line. I think that's absolutely ridiculous. I don't think that's ever a good response to a situation like this, and I think that the idea that Bergdahl suddenly should be treated that way is ridiculous to me. The last major thing he said is that justice should be done. I'd say that the injustice here is being done against Bergdahl by pushing this trial. Most deserters aren't tried. In fact, the vast majority are just sort of overlooked. They have discretion to move on from these things. There's only been one case of a deserter ever being tried, and that was in recent memory, and that was someone who defected to North Korea for 25 years. This is a completely different situation. This is someone who was trying to escape constantly. This is someone who was trying to get back and give important information to the U.S. military. I think that should be treated very differently, and justice should be enforced in a better way.
Okay. You said that the Army is... Oh, shit. I gotta start my timer.
Okay.
You said that the Army is responsible for the misbehavior before the enemy. Is your position that the Army should... what did you say?
I said that the Army was responsible for putting people in harm's way in their search for Bergdahl. I didn't say that they misbehaved before the enemy. I said that they rushed to action.
So is your position that the Army shouldn't pursue people who are missing in the field?
I said I think they should do so more carefully than they did in this instance.
Do you think that the Army would have rushed into the field if Bergdahl had left a note or made it clear what his intention was in leaving before leaving?
I'm not sure how the situation would have changed if he was not a Dust One and instead AWOL or POW or MIA. Whatever the situation, it might have changed their response. I don't know how.
Do you think that Bergdahl walking off the case was an effective way of addressing perceived misbehavior of officers in the military?
I don't think he knew of effective ways to deal with it. So in his mind, this was the only reasonable alternative.
But in fact, do you think it was effective?
No.
Okay. So this one is 5 minutes?
Yes.
Okay. Starting now. Khan's entire case is emblematic of the way in which the values and the processes of the military begin to unwind once we try to make exceptions and treat people who don't follow protocol and don't take discipline seriously. Khan makes the argument that I'm gonna address all of Khan's rebuttals, but I want to start with really Khan's only response to the charge of misbehavior before the enemy, which is that Khan feels that it was actually the Army itself that made the situation worse by rushing in and not properly assessing the situation. I don't understand what Khan's position is here. Should the Army have abandoned Bergdahl out in the field? Should the military abandon its core principles and abandon the philosophy that no man should be left behind? This is exactly what's at stake in this case. Bergdahl needs to be convicted through the process of a court so that we can uphold the rule of law, the order and the discipline of the military that allows it to achieve the goals of the U.S. while maintaining the safety of the men that serve and upholding our core values as American citizens. So I really want to draw attention to this point that there's really not a substantial rebuttal on Khan's behalf on the charge of misbehavior before the enemy. It's just a fact that thousands of troops were put in harm's way as a result of Bergdahl's action, as a result of an action that he took on his own based on his own assessment of the quality of troops, of the quality of officers in the Army. And again, I think that Bergdahl's own words give a sense of how he viewed the value of the troops that were looking for him after he was captured, when he says that the U.S. Army is the biggest joke the world has to laugh at. It's an army of liars, backstabbers, fools, and bullies. Those are Bergdahl's words describing the men and women that he put in danger by abandoning his post. So I want to briefly address Khan's claim that the systems are hard to access, that Bergdahl didn't really have a way of reporting the grievances he had. All of this assumes that Bergdahl's assessment is right, and it also assumes that Bergdahl is somehow entitled to make the changes that he feels are appropriate. Bergdahl, the Army is a massive organization with a myriad of different controls to make sure that it's functioning properly. It isn't the place of a single private in the Army to have the power to evaluate the performance of the Army and do whatever he feels is necessary to make the changes that he feels will result in a better Army. That is not Bergdahl's place. And what we and his desertion shows what happens when we allow privates to make that decision. It doesn't matter whether or not Bergdahl thought he was doing the right thing. The fact of the matter is that he was not doing the right thing, and he was out of line in assuming that it was his place to try and take on this task for himself. I also want to point out that Khan admits that Bergdahl's actions weren't effective in achieving all of this. So regardless of whatever his intentions were, all of this was for naught. He didn't achieve the goal that he was trying to reach. Finally, I want to address the issue. I just want to drive home the core facts of this case, which are that Bergdahl abandoned his post. He sent his belongings home because he knew that he would not be returning to his post. By his own account, he never planned on serving out the patrol that he abandoned. He never intended on going back to the duty that he was fulfilling, and by his own words, he despised the duty he was fulfilling. He felt that the job he was doing was not worthwhile and that he was serving for people who were incompetent. This is enough to establish the intent that when Bergdahl left his post, he was deserting. He was abandoning the Army. Finally, I want to return to the facts that there were 5 years of standing orders to look after Bergdahl, 5 years of additional burden placed on the U.S. Army operating in Afghanistan while they searched for Bergdahl. This clearly put U.S. troops in danger, and while it's impossible to assess exactly what damage was done, it is a near certainty that at least one serviceman died as a result of the second-order effects of Bergdahl's abandonment. So, on this count, we can convict Bergdahl of misbehavior before the enemy. I believe that Bergdahl is guilty on both counts, but I only need to win one count to win this debate. Thank you.
All right. So I'm just launching in, right?
Yep.
So the main thing that we want to consider in this debate is really what we're balancing here. And what that is for Pro, he's talking about the importance of justice and cohesiveness of the military, discipline, that kind of thing. On my side, we're talking about the capacity to dissent and the justice involved in that, and communication issues and resolving them. So let's compare those two issues. Let's make it as clear as possible. First of all, the issue of justice is not well upheld by my opponent. What he talks about is that, oh, well, we don't want to make exceptions for deserters. Most deserters are not tried. This is an exception. This is an exceptional circumstance. This is something different. And yet my opponent has made it clear that this should be the exception. So based on his own analysis that this should not be an exception, we should not try him. But in general, his idea that there's some form of justice served by trying him and making sure that he understands the gravity of his situation, I think he full well understands the gravity of his situation. And any sort of injustice caused by this is not going to have any lasting implications for the military. No one's going to abandon their post in the future because Bergdahl did it. My opponent has never made that argument, and in fact seemed to backtrack from it when I asked him about it in the first cross-ex. There's really no major effect of this injustice. The injustice of not allowing him to dissent, the injustice of keeping him on trial when he is suffering from 5 years of captivity with the prospect of being put in life imprisonment. That is tremendous injustice. The injustice of forcing him and his unit to deal with leaders that are threatening them physically on a constant basis, on the basis of photos that were taken of them, is ridiculous. And that is a terrible injustice, and it stands against the military as a whole. And that's something that needs to be solved. Now, he talks about how my position is that the military shouldn't have left it behind. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that the military should have taken more careful activities. Putting people in harm's way was a result of too rapid actions. They were too rapid in taking the actions that they took. That was the problem. It wasn't that they were suddenly put in harm's way because they're all on missions anyway. This mission didn't suddenly increase the danger only except by increasing the rapidity by which it happened. That was the problem. That was a mistake on the military's part. No one should be tried for misbehavior before the enemy for that. So he talks about the ability to uphold core values and hold the military cohesiveness. We have to uphold core values all the time, but there are plenty of other values to uphold as well. The value of dissenting against the value of dissent is really important and something that should be upheld. The value of someone being able to say, I don't feel safe and so I should be able to leave, should be upheld. But those things aren't upheld in the current military. Soldiers like Bergdahl don't have access to information about how to go about doing those things, and they should have that access. This should be a wake-up call to the military to get that access out to so many other people. The fact that it hasn't been done is ridiculous. Now, my opponent says that Bergdahl's actions weren't effective. This is entirely because he is standing trial. I mentioned this in the last round. Because he is being forced to stand trial, he is not able to get out there and have these conversations. He's not able to talk with military leadership. He's not able to talk with political leadership that could alter that military leadership as well. He's not able to have these substantive conversations because he is under threat that anything he could say could potentially implicate him and put him in jail for a long period of time, something he obviously wants to avoid. So this is a way to deal with it. We have to let him off in order to actually have that conversation and make it an effective route. I'm not saying that what he chose as his route was the most effective thing he could have done, but it can have an effect. And Pro's case is fundamentally damaging that effect. Now, he felt that, so as for this idea that, once again, the idea that he was deserting with intent to leave completely was entirely based in the current system. He wanted to change that current system and then return, not go back into the terrible system that he talks about so much in his letters. The fact of the matter is that Bergdahl was upholding a basic standard of communication, and one you should uphold with your ballot. All right.
Dude, that was good.
Hey, man.
Man,
I'll stop the broadcast.